Welcome, everyone. We will be beginning the webinar just in a couple of minutes. We still have a lot of people joining us, so we're going to give it another minute before we start the presentation. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Barbara Kaufman, Executive Vice President and COO at Newark Regional Business Partnership. We're delighted to welcome you to our continuing Return to Work series. I hope all of you enjoyed the weather over the weekend. I certainly did, and happy to have the weather be nice on the weekend and a little bit grayer to entice us back into our home offices. We are pleased to continue this Return to Work series and thank Quest Diagnostics for sponsoring the series. Today's webinar is sponsored by Newmark Knight Frank, our presenter, and we're very grateful to them for their support of this event. I want to just give a little bit of a preview on some of the other things that are coming up until the end of May, and then I will turn the program over to our presenter. Tomorrow, we're continuing our NRBP Nexus, and we do still have a few spots open. These are small group conversations, and the purpose is to be able to have one of our senior team and a few members, maximum of 6 in each group, give each other advice and recommendations for referrals. I hope that a few of you will let us know if you want to be part of that, and we will be filling that fairly quickly. Wednesday, we'll hear on a topic that I think is relevant to everyone, and that is how to present a great webinar, and also how to be a great webinar participant. So, for example, it might be some information about where do you position your camera, what sorts of things do you want to have or not have in the background. These are all things that will be covered by our presenter, and we're looking forward to hearing from Taft Communications on that. Thursday is our weekly happy hour, and we're switching from beverage providers, which we've been hearing over the past couple of weeks, and we'll be visiting with NJPAC and learning about the different aspects of NJPAC that are now available in your living room. We'll also raise a glass to each other and just toast our good health and hope for continued good health of all of our families. Next week, we're going to hear from Pillar College on the psychology of COVID. And this will talk about, our speaker will talk about how do we deal with isolation and fear, as well as any concerns in going back into the workplace and what sorts of things are coming up. The happy hour will be with All Points Distillery, and we'll be watching Gil Speyer prepare a signature drink and talking about his spirits and where those are available. So that's what's happening until the end of May. Please watch your emails and let us know if you have webinars that you're presenting and you would like us to share them with our members. If we get it at least a week in advance, we're able to put it into an email. Otherwise, we will share it on social media. If you have topics that you want to suggest for us to do, as we're doing with NKF today, please send those topics to me. Let me know what you'd like to present on, what's your expertise, that you think would be of interest to members. We think that these webinars will continue even after we are able to go back to being together in person, because we're finding that people are joining that had not come out to our in-person meetings. So we're really delighted that we're reaching a broader audience. I'm now going to turn the program over to Roy Abernathy, who will take us through his presentation for about the next 35 minutes. I'll then come on to moderate questions, and around 5:02, Chip Halleck, our President and CEO, will join us for some wrap-up comments. Only other note that I will make is that if you do have a question, please put it into the question area in the sidebar box, and I will be reviewing those questions and forwarding to Roy to ask the questions. So with that, I am going to turn this over to Roy and thank him and NKF again for working with us on this presentation. Roy?
Thank you, Barbara. It sounds like you guys are doing great things in Newark. And so we're just happy to be a part of it. Part of what I want to take you through today is just a roadmap on reentering the office or buildings as we all start to come back from sheltering in place. And so what I'll do is walk you through a step-by-step guide on how to look at buildings and then the tenant spaces within buildings, just relative to the local and national guidelines on how to re-enter the workplace. So when we think about kind of this impact, I joke sometimes I've been waiting 30 years for something like this to come along. I've spent a lot of my career working with zoonotic diseases, being those diseases that go back and forth between the human population and the animal population, with entities like Public Health Canada and CDC, but also universities and private organizations. A lot of what we're doing today is really trying to separate the humans from the virus in ways that follow almost a laboratory protocol, or follow a protocol that really separates the two from a environmental, but also from a touch and from a people perspective. So we'll walk you through that as we go through today. I've got a team of people around the world, so just under 250, that are focused and have been focused on this for the last 23 weeks. So looking at kind of how this started in China, how it migrated around the world, and ultimately how today we're trying to protect people in the workplace from the virus. And so when we talk about this worldview, we're really talking about the way we frame it as AC, or after Corona. And we look at that from a business and environmental perspective, a real estate and a workplace perspective, an organizational and an economic perspective, and a social and a political perspective. And I won't go into these in depth, and I know we're going to provide this presentation to everyone. But when I look at real estate and workplace, we're really focusing on kind of a short-term cost focus. And from a workplace perspective, we're really measuring how well people are working from home today. And there are positives and negatives to that we'll talk about. But also how being distributed from a workforce perspective is kind of redefining how we work in the office or how we work in the workplace. So what we're seeing around the world, we're really coming back around the world. I mean, we started a number of weeks ago in Asia initially, but Asia, Europe, and the US now has, almost in every geography, has some ask of coming back to the office or coming back to the workplace, whether that be retail, office, professional services, or other aspects around even manufacturing. Today, transportation is the biggest bottleneck, and being in the Northeast, you're seeing that as a big implication or a big impact. I know we're talking to MTA about kind of how they're going to come back and what the capacities might be. A lot of coming back is about cleaning regimens, both along the journey and then in the workplace, about how buildings are going to restart, and that is critical, especially from a Legionnaire's perspective, or the perspective or the possibility that there be a Legionnaire's bacteria in the building. I've got a number of clients asking me for a corona-free building, and today there's no way to have a corona-free building. I mean, the reality is what we can do is kind of take the 100% chance that we might expose to the virus and kind of dwindling that chance down as much as we can in the workplace. Now, we're doing that by taking temps, we're doing that by increasing cleaning regimes, and then we're doing that by contact tracking or tracing. Ultimately, now today we're planning at 6 foot or 2 meter distances in most cases. I think Germany's doing 1.5 meters, but most of the places are around 6 feet. And one of the biggest implications we see long term to bringing people back is we're not going to have the family support infrastructure that we've had in the past with daycare and adult care kind of helping us be able to go back into the office. So when we look at what's happening kind of in your region, a lot of this is really coming down to the transportation mode. And we're even talking to MTA about how to do distancing, how to manage this, and how to support it long term. But this is just a preview into some of the initial thoughts on kind of how to do this on the transit system. For the big things that are working today, so from a best practice perspective, screening or asking employees in the workforce questions on the left-hand side, and through that being able to gauge whether they have been exposed to someone with the virus, and then taking people's temperature, whether you use thermography or a digital thermometer, similar to what's on the right-hand side. So you're going to see these two scenarios or these two types of screening people before they come back be fairly pervasive in the United States. And so when we really think about kind of the impact or the way to kind of prevent the virus from being in the environment, it comes down to environmental changes and behavioral changes. The environmental ones are easier, so it may be like taking furniture out of a lobby so that you're not increasing the risk of exposure by having more surfaces in that space, or changing out air filters on the mechanical system. The behavior ones may be more, may take more work. So it may be that we're having to help people understand and implement personal cleaning aspects in the space. So where they're cleaning their work surface or cleaning their devices before they put them down on their desk as they bring them into the space. So what we've created is a very simple 10-step process, both from the occupant of the office or from the tenant perspective, as well as from the landlord perspective. And these start with having a conversation with the landlord and the tenant kind of across the building. Then goes to a risk overlay, which mirrors what many of the jurisdictions are asking you to do. And that's just looking at the areas that need to be cleaned more often, doing a workforce survey, which asks the employees who needs to come back in the office and who can work from home more over a longer period of time. And then looking at your office or your workplace to understand what the capacity is. So how many people can be housed using a 6 foot a 6 foot standard distance or social distance within the workplace. And by having the risk overlay, the workforce overlay, and the capacity overlay, you're able to synthesize and literally look at what your occupancy strategy can be coming back. And then it's about communicating and implementing. On the landlord side, it's similar, but they're performing a service and amenity overlay. So how will people access the services that are in the building? What amenities might they open or not open? Talking to the tenant about the occupancy strategy that the tenant needs to manage and how that might be phased. Looking at occupancy patterns, so like when people might come into the building based on transportation modes. And then doing what we call a door to floor overlay. So the front door of the building to the floor of the area that you as a tenant might occupy. And ultimately using that to determine their cleaning protocols on their side. And then discussing those with the tenant. A lot of this is about training, about communications, and about best practice. So conversations with the landlord around building access, how might you get into the building, where are the common areas and how might they be managed during this process, what are the cleaning protocols, and what are the cleaning specifications. And ultimately here we want to follow the CDC guidelines where possible on both the EPA cleaning products that are recommended, as well as the processes that are coming out from CDC on how to get in the building and even how to ride the elevators or manage the elevators. The landlord's going to want to know when you might be bringing people in, how you might deal with visitors or even contract employees or vendors that come into the space. Are you as a tenant going to take protective measures like providing gear for our personal protective equipment for people to wear, like masks or like face coverings? And if so, will they have them, or will the employees have them when they first come back to the building? And then how might you change your office hours during this approach? And then ultimately how specialty spaces or spaces that are not typical or office or workplace spaces like showrooms, like cafeterias, even medical clinics and other types of occupancies might work. From a landlord perspective, they're going to further want to know what your occupancy strategy is. Are you only going to bring in essential employees or do some other sort of occupancy in the building? are the services and amenities that you're going to have in your space going to change? So like how will lunch work, pending other types of services? What are the additional cleaning protocols that you need from an occupant perspective? And then how you might screen. And I know there are different examples around the country where screening is done by a survey, it's done by taking a temp as you walk in, asking people to keep travel journals or other approaches. So from a best practice perspective on the office side, installing hand sanitizer stations, making it easy for people when they initially come in to sanitize their hands. Consider potentially even removing 60% of the chairs in like conference rooms and shared spaces, or maybe roping them off. There's going to be a lot more waste in the space going forward than there has been in the past. So making trash can receptacles really easy to use. And then ultimately even reducing the seating in your lobby or in break room to minimize the opportunity for people to come into contact with the virus on any surfaces. From a landlord perspective, as we mentioned, taking furniture out of the lobby, but also making the visitor system or the vendor experience more touchless. So less having to check someone's ID, more being able to kind of route visitors or even pre-screen before they get to the building. So from a behavior perspective, we're going to have a new handshake. Personally, I like the digital hug where you put your hand over your heart. I know one of our Northeastern offices came back with the elbow bump. One thing to note there is your elbow in this model is probably the dirtiest surface on your body. So you may want to think that one as an option. Seriously though, from a keeping it light perspective, make sure that the workforce is not bringing things from the office to the workplace. We want to reduce the opportunity to carry contamination between the two places as much as possible. When they first get to the office, have them clean their work area and then clean anything that they brought with them. Then once they finish, go clean their hands or wash their hands. Don't carry your laptop around in the office or at home, because the laptop, we tend to put our thumb on the keyboard surface and our 4 fingers under it. And so every time we put that laptop somewhere, we run the risk that we're going to pick something up by putting our 4 fingers under it as we move it. And then clean cell phones, anything that again travels from home to the office. If you can't minimize it, you need to make sure that you clean it. And then from a landlord perspective, initially having ambassadors to help remind occupants as they come into the building. It typically takes 3 to 4 weeks for people to kind of naturalize around a behavior, and 90 days for them to adopt it without having to think about it. So consider between that period of time, we're really training people on what this new protocol looks like. Providing clear directions. One thing to keep in mind is that any signage that you put up is probably going to be up somewhere between 6 and 9 months. So think of durability when you consider kind of the things that you're going to use to mark areas off, or they're going to use to identify. And don't put signs at 5 feet. People don't tend to read them at that height. They tend to be looking down when they walk through. So put the signs lower so that they're easier to see. So our suggested approach is do a risk overlay, which first takes your floor plan or your floor area and identifies all the areas that are potentially a high risk of the virus being deposited and then picked up by someone. Make sure that those areas are cleaned more frequently, or that the cleaning of those areas aligns with your expected occupancy strategy. These are all available online and very easy to use. So we get to the end of the process, I've got a tag for where you can go find the more detailed aspect of how to do a risk overlay, a capacity overlay, and a workforce overlay. The capacity overlay, the second one, is identifying how many people can sit on a floor using a 6-foot social distancing methodology. It walks you through step by step from enclosed spaces to open spaces to shared spaces. And then the workforce overlay is surveying the workforce to understand who needs to come in versus who can continue to work from home long term. I will point out that with most organizations, there's a hidden percentage of the population that needs to come into the office because they do not have the infrastructure or the childcare or other aspects that they need at home. They might have been kind of band-aiding it through this initial part of working from home by working extra hours or working around the issue, but realize that there will be a population that you can only find by surveying or asking whether they need to come into the office because they don't have the infrastructure or the means of kind of taking care of the other occupants in their home when they're not there or while they are there. At the same time, the landlord should be doing a reboarding process of their own that looks at the risk on each floor, especially where they have multi-tenants, where they have spaces that need to be cleaned more frequently. And if a landlord is opening up the stairwells to do kind of an upstair and a downstair, they need to look at those. And then the last thing to leave you with relative to that is everybody is so focused, like on the right-hand side of how do we get people up into the building, that people are forgetting we're going to have to queue to get out of the building. So like in this floor plan on the left, the landlord, or if you're a full tenant in that building, the tenant should be looking at how do you queue to get into the elevators or the stairs to get out of the building at the end of the day. The model on the right is a door-to-floor analysis and really looks at, in this aspect, how we would take a 16-story building, there's no 13th floor, and plan the elevators. So this building actually has 8 elevators, and we're able to get everyone in the building through a scheduled approach in just under 2 hours, using this staggered approach where one elevator is assigned to each 2 floors on the upper floors, and then one elevator is assigned to 3 floors on the lower floor. And you'll notice the dash circle around the 4. We're assuming that people can easily walk up the first 4 or 5 floors in a building. So we may have less elevators dedicated to the first 5 floors than we do to other floors in this approach. But there are a whole series of approaches you can use. The landlord or the building owner should be doing an elevator performance review where they look at the ability of the elevator to perform differently. It may be that you can speed things up because you're going to have less people on the elevator, so shorter trip times from floor to floor. They should do a traffic study based on what you need or based on your occupancy strategy to determine kind of how many people, how many trips the elevators need to make. Then they should come to you with a strategy, communicate the approach, and make sure it aligns with your expectations. And then this is one thing we're going to have to continue to measure and adjust as potentially more or less people come into the building. Some interesting ways to deal with this are you can do like the Disney model where you reserve a time ahead of time. So what you may want to do is say, okay, we're a 50% occupancy in the building or occupant in the building. We're going to have our staff come in between 7 and 7:30, 8 and 8:30 each day, and we want more than half the elevators dedicated to bringing our staff up in those cycles. You can also do staggered, where you might have one elevator like in the prior approach that serves like the first floor, second, third, fourth. The next elevator may serve the first floor and like 3 other floors up in the stack. So basically identifying or allocating elevators to serve specific floors. All of these models should be based on an approach where you're trying to limit the exposure of your workforce to other workforces in the building, just try to diminish the ability for the virus to get transferred. A lot of things we're seeing around communications and technology is really how to push and pull information. I know a number of states, and I haven't seen it from New Jersey yet, are requesting that you ask each employee 3 questions before they come in for the day. Have they been exposed to the virus? Does anyone in their family have the virus? Are they showing any signs of the virus, so a fever or other? This gives you an easy way to kind of manage that back and forth, and can even tie into a kiosk that's in the lobby area that lets people opt in to taking their temp there as well. Some states are requiring that you actually do this for visitors as well, so that you would have to pre-screen a visitor before they came in the building. But all of this is to reduce touch, to make it easy and comfortable for everyone, and to make sure that you meet the suggested requirements from a screening perspective. You're also going to see the thermography or the temperature taking get smarter. This is temperature taking with basically artificial intelligence built into it. So this can sample larger groups. It can also determine whether they're socially distancing and whether they're wearing masks. So it starts to get into not policing, but basically reinforcing with the staff or with the occupants of the building. What we see the first 6 months, we're going to continually take fever. We think the 3 to 9 month stage, we're going to be more people are going to be coming in. So we're going to be reinforcing socially distancing. And as we get 6 to 36 months, not just temperature alerts, but also the social distancing. And we think by that point in time, we'll have the automatic contact tracing kind of added to the platforms. So there's technologies going at the speed of light relative to a lot of this, and things are getting repurposed around those factors. So from the biggest aspect of this, we say that this is really 90% people change and 10% physical space change. The reality is helping the individuals, helping the people managers who honestly are the most impacted by this. The people managers didn't expect to wake up one day and have their entire workforce work from home. And then helping the leadership really understand how to maximize this platform, kind of work during this period of disruption and best kind of reboard or re-enter the office is important. You're going to be asked as employers to take metrics, to do surveys after people come back into the office. And if there's an outbreak, you're going to be asked to provide information around who might have been in the space with other people so that we can do contact tracing. You're also going to be expected to make adjustments, just like the elevator that we talked about earlier, as time goes by. And again, the signage and the communication templates should be longer term. Again, we don't know yet how long we'll be socially distancing in the workplace, but we believe that it will be at least for the next 6 to 9 months. And lastly, from a physical environment perspective, we are not having a lot of clients ask us to make major changes to the physical environment. Most of it's installing signage, kind of removing furniture, roping things off, and creating that social distancing model in the office. So at this point, it's not a big capital expense approach. In most cases, it's more of a subtractive approach where we're taking things out or limiting access to areas or to infrastructure. So all of our information is available from our website. We created these tools for you to be able to use them and to easily kind of manage the process on your own. We can also host a video chat if you would like once you've gone through the process, and we've offered that to everyone if you really want to ask us questions. I've got a core team here in the US of just under 40 that are focused on helping people or helping organizations navigate this process. If you need help with doing the overlays, especially as the regulations or the recommendations come out, we could do with that. And then we have had a few clients who really ask us to come out and say, you know, Roy, I don't have time to do this in my workplace. Can you find a way to just do this for us? So some clients and some organizations have just needed someone to do it. And so to help with this, I know there are a number of resources that are members of your organization. So whether it be printing and signage, or whether it be promo products or branded materials, and again, we'll send out this presentation. Here's contact information to help you as you go through this process. And I will tell you that a lot of these things we're seeing huge backlogs on. So going through somebody locally, not just going out and try to find this through Amazon or through Granger or other places, is a better option on how to do this or how to approach it. So Barbara, I think that was the last slide I had if you want to open up for questions. Barbara, I think you're on mute.
Thank you, Roy. I didn't realize I was still on mute. I was trying not to have, you saw my lips moving, but nothing happening. That really was very, very helpful to us. I think one of the biggest messages and takeaways for people participating is that a lot of the behavior, you said 90% is personal behavior, and it's a matter of having each of us be responsible for doing everything that we can to make sure that we're not part of the spread of the virus, and that's with being exceedingly careful with our cleanliness, observing the practices of wearing the mask, making sure that we're cleaning our personal items, etc. I want to stay on this slide for a moment and say that these are the printers and promotional product members that we have as part of NRBP, and I do appreciate Roy's plug for doing things locally, especially at this time. Some of the companies that are listed are small businesses. They have had their business diminish in some shape or form, some to a huge degree. So if you are able to support them, we very much encourage you to do so. I do want to note, to Roy's point about signage and how long the signs need to be up, that in addition to doing print signage, we do have an option for digital signage, and that may be a way to be able to change messages quickly if there are different restrictions that you want to share. I'm going to pose a few questions for you, Roy. We don't have a whole lot of audience questions, but one of the things this has me thinking about is the multi-tenanted buildings, and that different landlords are going to take more of a hands-on or a hands-off approach to it. How, as a tenant in a building, if a landlord isn't really doing much to manage the flow, what recommendations do you have for the tenants to be able to manage their own protection, I'll say?
Well, I mean, certainly ask them the questions that we outline in the tool to see what the response is. If they don't have a response, at least for your floors, I mean, take a look at it from a landlord perspective. In some cases, you may need to bring in additional janitorial services to do that during that period of time. The other thing is from getting your people into and out of the building. I mean, realistically, you have to work with the landlord to some extent. If they're actually not doing anything around it, what you can do is kind of schedule your employees to come in at a certain time and kind of help manage them from the lobby up into your space. And a lot of that depends on what floors you're on. But 3 key things: ask the landlord the questions. If they don't answer, consider how you would answer them for the landlord and try to issue that back and act on that approach with the landlord within the building. What we did actually have a group today that the landlord wasn't being responsive, so the tenants got together. So the chief financial officers for the different organizations basically held a virtual meeting where they got together and decided, as the major tenants in the building, here's what they needed, and looked at how to provide those services within the tenant base. And then the third aspect of it, and I think this is going to be the harder piece, look for some way to keep the vendors, the people who would traditionally like deliver packages or bring the mail or things like that into your space. Find a way for them to maybe give things to you in the lobby or not have them come all the way into their space. If you can imagine, it's one thing for me to bring you your mail and your packages. It's another thing for me to walk through with 1,000 pieces of mail from a number of different tenants or other places in the building and go through your space. So kind of, protect your boundaries to some extent. And then, I grew up on the animal side of all this. Protect your boundaries, protect your herd. So try to protect your workforce from being exposed in any way to the other workforces that are in the building, because they may not follow the same protocols that you're following.
Yeah. And what that raises for me is something that I hadn't even really thought about, which is that as people come back, it's very likely that they're going to be ordering lunch in as opposed to going out. So there'll be more deliveries coming into the building, and that'll need to be managed, particularly around the noon hour. So I would think that there'd need to be some staggering of when orders get placed, so that you have some coming before the lunch hour, and you don't have all the delivery people coming in at the noon hour.
Well, and a couple of things that have worked well there is, one is kind of the ice cream approach. So the old ice cream truck that would come through the neighborhood and ring the bell. So if you want to consider, you may have a vendor that you trust that brings lunches or brings things into your office and does it, like you mentioned, on maybe you order in the morning for the whole office, or have people place their orders as they come in. I will tell you that we found that kind of creating a way for maybe a person who would normally clean your coffee areas, your beverage areas, be there to serve coffee, so that people aren't having to touch the coffee machine or the coffee pot throughout the day. And then also from a lunch perspective, if people need things warmed in a microwave, having kind of a coffee bar person who manages that. So they're the ones touching all the devices and cleaning as they go. versus just having people kind of queue in line to be able to do that, and having the whole office basically touch all those devices. So every opportunity you can find to kind of make things less touch and more touchless, the better you'll be at kind of carving that percentage possibility off. And we've seen both of those work well. In larger or taller buildings, we've seen it work well for a vendor to come once a day to every 3 or 4 floors and kind of offer lunch. And so, like, working with either your occupancy or adjacent tenants to say that we'll work with one vendor, they may do it from the elevator lobby and just have people come and get lunch from them. And then finally,
I would imagine.
Sorry, go Bob.
I was going to say, I would imagine that would work better in buildings where there are larger companies as opposed to ones where there's a lot of small companies.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the smaller companies, you just really have to get with the adjacent tenants and try to work it out. I mean, it's in everyone's best interest that you find a way to simplify it and to reduce the number of touches.
Okay. We have a question. Do you think these measures are going to be the new normal, or once a vaccine is developed, will you go back to business? And I think maybe you could base this a little bit on what you've observed from your prior experience with different pandemics that you've dealt with around the world.
Well, if you consider it kind of globally, I don't think we'll ever go back to exactly where we were before. And so if you look at other pandemic or even just viral outbreaks around the world, people had got more comfortable wearing a mask. And so when things like this first occur, you'll see people put masks on. You may even end up with a mask left in your desk drawer, kind of long term as a remnant of all of this. I think we will see behaviors that will change, but I think eventually the handshake will come back. I think eventually we'll come back closer to where we were. I think the biggest takeaways are that question about, can a percentage of the workforce work from home? We won't ask that question anymore. The new question will be, how much of the workforce can work in a mobile or flexible way? And how will that affect kind of how, when, and where we work? Will be probably the one biggest impact or thing that sticks long term.
Okay. We have one correction to the slide. ARC Document Solutions. The phone number is 973-624-2583, and we will share this in the thank you for attending email, as well as a new slide with that phone number on it. One of the things that comes to mind for our members, we've got about 40 to 50 nonprofit organizations that are members of NRBP, and they depend heavily on running fundraising events, which traditionally have been in person. And some of them are attempting to do online events. But I'm just wondering what you've observed around the world, number one. Number two, that one of the things that I heard this morning from someone was that he has been to a couple of conferences that would have been in person, that would have required him to travel, and he's now been able to participate. So I wondered what you're hearing about that, and in particular, what you're hearing about how the networking that happens informally at those conferences might be replicated.
Well, and so far what we're seeing is most of the conferences are going to some sort of virtual or online. The ones that are most difficult to manage are the ones where you might have a big vendor floor, a big vendor event, where you're seeing new product or getting a chance to talk face-to-face with vendors kind of over a product or in a space where they've kind of managed what they're demonstrating. That's been the harder part to do, and probably the piece in some cases that's been deferred. New product launches have become virtual, and so I know as one example where it was a big equipment manufacturer, they did kind of a cool video where they launched it as a cool video and kind of hosted a virtual party as they did that. But your point about the networking and kind of the the informality of that when we went to these conferences before and kind of the social ways to do it. The only good example I've seen so far is kind of a virtual cocktail hour to go over something, or I have seen, and this may be a way to kind of flip your marketing dollars, packages sent to homes that kind of invited people to a special online event during something. And I know we've done it from a school perspective and done it from a kind of a social or even a religious perspective, to where we've sent something to connect, had the groups kind of come together, almost as like a surprise box or something in the process, and done digital and virtual scavenger hunts. I attended a great online auction that was virtual the other day. And actually, I thought it was more fun than kind of the physical silent auction approach or virtual auction approach, because everybody was kind of engaged at the same time versus kind of writing your name down as you went. So I think we're going to find new ways to do it, Barbara. I think honestly, the more creative are probably going to be the ones that are able to kind of bring bigger groups together. So creativity is probably the key in all that. But I do think we're going to have to find a way. Sorry.
That auction idea is interesting. If everybody is, I really would wonder how that you manage that, and how you handle all the bids coming in from different people if they're all doing it at the same time. It does kind of replicate what would happen in an event when you're in the last 5 minutes and you say the bidding's going to close, and have people walking up to check who's outbidding them.
Well, and we did it with a Survey Monkey, so our survey tool, where people are actually able to put their bids in. But the coolest thing, each company had to come up with a way to showcase what they had in the silent auction. So it gave a chance for companies to really talk about kind of what they were doing as an organization and kind of tie it back. So, unlike being able to just kind of put something on the table, you got an opportunity to have a little fun at kind of showing where it came from or what it was. And so I know in one case it was a signed baseball, not a baseball card, but a picture of a baseball player. And they actually brought the baseball player on and had him take questions, but he would only take questions from somebody under 8 years old. And so the whole group loved those questions more than what they would have gotten. The adults were the ones bidding on it, but the kids were the ones asking the questions.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah. I think it's great that you are able to bring the experience, around the world. Are you seeing that other countries are doing more in terms of going back to work than what's happening in the United States? And one thing I heard today was that Texas, which is one of the states that's reopened more, has had a sudden surge in cases, and just wondering what you're observing from all the people that you talk to around the country and around the world.
I actually live in Atlanta, or just north of Atlanta, so we were one of the first states back. So everyone's taking a very wait and see approach, but we were I live in one of the feeder counties, so like similar to a submarket there. And we had only had 17 deaths and just over 500 cases total out of almost a 1 million person population. So we just didn't see it as much before we got back. But we're waiting to see what kind of opening the state back up is done. And I don't think we'll really see that till the beginning of June. So the states that have seen a resurgence so far, it may have been because people didn't shelter in place more so than kind of people came back after the governors opened it up. So it'll be very interesting to see. I mean, where my parents are down in Naples, they opened the beaches, then closed the beaches because they've seen an uptick. So if there's any advice I can give, it's really threefold to all your members. Wash your hands, and then wash your hands again, because that is the number one way to keep the virus from transferring and help and keeping you from getting it. The second thing is, from a due diligence perspective, we have to stay diligent as we go through this, because there will be spikes. There'll be spikes by community. There'll be spikes by geography. We may even have spikes by a state. But when you really start to analyze those numbers that are coming from Texas, you'll find that's in a couple of different markets. And the third is really look to the science. Don't believe the hype. Just because it pops up on the news, in a lot of cases, it's not always the reality. So, look at the details as this stuff comes out, because the forensics that we're doing on the virus, how it broke out, and kind of what has occurred because of it, is really where we're learning, more so than kind of the mass media aspect of all this.
Okay. One question is, we do have some institutions like libraries, government agencies, museums that welcome the general public. And the question that was posed just now was, how do we handle it if we're challenged by somebody wanting to come in? For example, if a museum is open and allowing the general public to come in with social distancing in place, if someone insists on coming in without a mask, for example, what sorts of things are you seeing, or do you recommend when that might happen?
I mean, if they're not following the protocol that's either been issued by the state or the jurisdiction, I think the right thing to do is probably not to allow them to enter, just to protect the other occupants. If there's no direction from the state or the jurisdiction on wearing masks in public, and I would consider a library certainly a public space, a museum certainly a public space, I think from a direction perspective, you have to ask them to follow the local protocol or the local restrictions. Mm-hmm. And if they don't, then you may have to refuse them access. I know we're doing it with one museum right now where they're actually giving tickets, so you can reserve a time ahead of time. And they reserve the right that if someone comes in and doesn't follow the protocol, they'll close the museum. Now that impacts everyone behind you in the process, but their final pushback was, okay, if you won't wear the mask, we're closed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One more question was about eyewear, and the question that's being posed is that this person heard that the virus can be spread through the eyes. Are you seeing that in other countries or other locations that there are recommendations to wear something to protect the eyes?
I'll go back and look. I don't know that I've seen anything around that now, because it really is going to the lungs. So it's getting in through your mouth or your nose. So I haven't seen any science behind the eyes, but I'll go out and look, Nancy, and see if I see anything this afternoon, and send you an update if I see anything.
Yeah, I haven't heard anything. That concludes the questions that I have and that we have posed. Chip, maybe you want to come back on if there's anything that occurs to you that we want to ask Roy while we have him with us.
I just have one question, Roy, and part, I think you answered it already. You talked a lot about, behavior being 90% of this, but looking forward prospectively, how are people who are going to be looking for space change their requirements going forward? What kinds of things are they going to be demanding of their landlords, having had this experience? And again, earlier you said that you thought we'd go back to shaking hands and those kinds of things. I don't disagree with you, but if you're responsible for your real estate going forward, what kinds of requirements do you think tenants will be looking for going forward? Anything different?
I don't think we know yet, and Barbara had asked early in the process kind of how this maybe compares to other outbreaks or other situations we've seen. And so if you go back to 9/11, everybody said initially nobody would want to be up in the top tower or the top part of buildings. It took us about 7 years to kind of forget that, or to get that concern out of our system. And so if you assume that the impact of this virus might take the same 7-year cycle for us to kind of forget the people impact of it. So we may return to more normal, certainly at that period of time. But I think what tenants are starting to focus on initially is, how do I create a strategy where everything's not in one bucket, like within the building? or within a building. How do I deal with the transportation infrastructure, especially in the Northeast in the model? How do I focus on kind of compartmentalizing my occupancy of a building or a space? So instead of having like 4 floors that are all connected, do I do something where maybe it's 2 floors and 2 floors? So if something happened, I wouldn't have to close the entire office potentially, or the building potentially. And then, to some of the things that Barbara was mentioning earlier that landlords may not be thinking about now, if a landlord's not really willing to work with you on elevator access and other aspects of how you get up into your space today, realize this was a pretty light virus when it comes to, it transmitted really quickly, but it didn't kill a huge portion of the population. If you can imagine that this type of virus wasn't picking on the people who are more at risk, but really picked on everyone the same way. And if it had the same efficacy, but a higher mortality rate, we would be much more concerned about it and have much more of a concern about that relationship with the tenant and landlord. So if there's any time for a tenant and a landlord to kind of, show their empathy between the two parties and work together, it is now. And so I think tenants more than anything will look to those landlords who are really supportive and help them through this process and help them get their business back on their feet. Those will be the landlords that win in the process.
Great. Roy, thank you very much. Really appreciate your spending this afternoon with us and giving us some great insight into how we should be thinking. And we certainly hope that all of you remain safe going forward. Take advantage of the programs that Barbara mentioned, whether they be more webinars that we've got coming up or networking. And let's also follow Roy's admonition: protect your boundaries, protect your herd. That's a great way of looking at it. So with that, Roy, thank you again for spending some time with us. We wish you all well. We look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you.